So welcome along, ladies and gentlemen, to your weekly SETI seminar series. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by the author of two books here, Nick Kanas. He's a professor at UC San Francisco. He has been on the Department of Psychiatry there for over 30 years. He started by doing work with veterans, alcoholism, PSTD, and schizophrenia. Clearly this was a good preparation for work with astronauts. And he then went into programs studying astronauts on Mir and on the ISS. He's recently written a second edition of his book, Space Psychology and Psychiatry. And he has this non-psychiatry book, which is called Star Maps, History, Artistry, and Cartography. We'll have these up the front for you to have a look at. So today he's going to talk to us about From the Earth to the Stars, Psychological Issues During Space Missions, which is a new paper that's just coming out in Acta Astronautica. So if you'll join me in welcoming Nick.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's nice to see you all here. Looks like you all found your way this last day that you're going to be coming to this particular site. The story of studying astronauts it takes even more meaning because for 20 years I studied schizophrenics at the VA, and where my lab was and clinical work was based, and I've always sort of been a space cadet. And so every year I would apply to do some work with NASA, and every year they would not even review it because they weren't that interested until the space station came. And then suddenly there was a great deal of interest in studying at the crew level how people get along in space. And so we made some proposals that were finally approved, and we're kind of on our way in studying this kind of group. The talk I'm giving today, though, is kind of a fun talk for me anyway, because I keep getting asked questions about, well, what about going beyond the moon? What about going beyond Earth's orbit? What can you say about the psychological issues affecting people on these kinds of missions? So I've organized a talk around this. I'm going to start, though, with some factual material and then start speculating. And hopefully at the end, it won't be too much science fiction for folks, but you might have your own opinions as well. You know, space is obviously not the Earth, and we've had some years, though, to take a look at some of the interactions of people in space on orbit, as well as to the moon. So what have we learned from that? What can we say about the psychology of individuals and crews who are going on relatively long missions, about 6 months, but in the orbit of the Earth? Well, I think it's useful to sort of think about the crews, space crews, in terms of 4 areas, and certainly these areas have driven our research and have sort of allowed us to kind of focus on it. The first is over time. What happens to people over time who are in space? Right now, the longest that person's been in space was Polyakov, a Russian physician cosmonaut. He was up for 14 months. But there have been groups of people that have been up 7 months, 8 months longer. And so we have some information about that. And people have tried to generalize in space from other long-standing, isolated and confined environments, such as the Antarctic and submarines, and some of the newer models now, out in Mars, the NEMO submersible missions and other submersible missions. So we have a body of knowledge. And what some people have found is that after the halfway point of a relatively long mission, and I'm basically talking about missions that are longer than 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks is sort of a turning point. That's when people start reporting crew breakups and behavior like territoriality and things happening. The Russians think 6 weeks is kind of the key period. So I'm not talking about shuttle or shorter term missions. I'm talking really about space station type of missions. That after the halfway point of the mission, however long the mission is, there's a sort of a psychological shift in people's minds, and it affects how they feel. For example, in some Antarctic studies, after the halfway point, it goes something like this. The people are on the ice and kind of isolated, and they're waiting and they're waiting, and they get to the halfway point, and they say, well, I've made it halfway, hooray. And then they realize they have another half to go. And it's that other half to go that results in some studies with increases of depression and morale drops, and crews tend to break up a bit. So this has given rise to a term, the third quarter phenomenon, that people have talked about, and it's in the lore. And so you'll find astronauts and other people believing in it and thinking that it occurs. We were interested in studying our space crews in terms of looking for this, so we looked at our data in terms of quarters, but also the biphasic model at the halfway point. The halfway point seemed to be something important, at least reported in some analogs, but not all. Some people didn't find third quarter, even in the Antarctic. Second is the crew-ground interactions. This is kind of a variation of in-group, out-group behavior. It's because the space missions up till now have had relatively low autonomous conditions where the crew members take their marching orders pretty much from the ground. That interaction, the interplay between the crew and the ground is very, very important. And so I think it's legitimate to consider not only the group that's isolated in space, but the group that's on the ground monitoring and in some ways directing and scheduling their activities. So we got interested in the communication between the people in space and people on the ground. In our studies, we considered it and conceptualized them as having two interesting groups. One are the astronauts and cosmonauts in space, and the other are people in the various mission control centers on the ground who are involved with their either payloads, for example, out of Huntsville, or the direct mission operations out of Houston. These people are also important, and how they interact is another important factor. So the crew-ground interaction is another thing that informed our research. Heterogeneity. We don't have the right stuff astronauts anymore, or I should say the right stuff has changed. We now have men and women. We now have scientists going up with the jet jockeys. We now have people coming and going for different reasons, politicians, people who can pay. And so the crews are very heterogeneous. And what does that mean? Plus, more and more now we're going to be having heterogeneous crews in terms of different national groups in space with different native languages. So that also adds a degree of complexity. What can we say about that? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It will occur, and so we have to figure out what does it mean to have groups of people that are come from different kinds of backgrounds and maybe have different motives for being in space. And finally, leadership. Going way, way back in studies in the 60s, people were looking at the leader in the Antarctic bases. And in the small small group social psychological literature, there are a lot of ways of characterizing leadership. What has commonly been used in isolated and confined environments, ICEs, groups such as Antarctic and submarines and space capsules, are that there's two leadership roles. The task role, that is, directing traffic, setting the schedule, telling people what to do, setting up the base on the ice, setting up the base on the moon, taking care of the business. That's one important role of a leader, task or instrumental role is another word. And the other is a support or emotional role of the leader, taking care of the person who's having kind of a tough day, monitoring the morale in general and trying to create an environment where people can be happy. And some of the studies in the Antarctic that were done even in the 60s, the role of the leader shifts over time. So early on when there's a lot to do, everybody's focused on activities, and so the task role is really important. But after a while, maybe when it gets really cold and the crew goes inside for the winter, they get kind of stir crazy. The morale drops, and so the leader has to shift his or her mindset into maintenance of the morale and the emotional state of the group. And so there's less to do. Things are kind of on autopilot. And so paying attention to the morale becomes another leadership function. How does that work in space? What can we say about that? So these are the areas that we isolated from a lot of the literature, and they kind of directed the way we did our studies. And we've done a lot of studies. Most recently, we just finished the study, a set of pilot studies that I mentioned, Adrian, that is coming out in ACTA in probably about the next issue, September, October, where we studied some ground environments such as Houghton Mars and the Mars 105-day mission, looking at autonomy, where people had more autonomy. So that's kind of the hot topic nowadays, is high autonomy, because people are worried about going to a near asteroid or Mars where the crew members will be actually planning their own schedules. And how are we going to do that? And there's much gnashing of teeth about it in mission control, because they have the control and they're going to give up the control. And what does it mean for the crew? How do we do this? So that's kind of the hot area. But what I'm going to be talking about today are primarily low autonomy environments, because in our two main studies that we did, the MIR and the ISS study, that was what we were given. These were basically on-orbit missions, a lot of interaction with ground control. My colleagues at the University of California and at the VA hospital, and I and colleagues in Russia at the IBMP, basically were interested in looking at a number of the four main areas that I talked about earlier and how they impact on MIR and ISS subjects, or the astronauts as well as the ground control. These are our two study samples. The shuttle MIR mission, we studied 5 US crews and 4 Russian crews, and a set of mission control personnel both in TSUP, which is a Russian mission control center, and the Americans based at TSUP who were studying. MIR was a Russian project, and so the operations was centered at the mission control in Moscow. But the Americans had a little area with an American flag and a few dials and computers, and that was sort of their mission control. In the ISS, which up till now anyway has been largely American driven, we studied 6 complete crews composed of Russians and Americans, and a number of mission control people at TSUP, again monitoring the Russians, but also 2 sites in the United States, at Marshall for the payload mission control and for Johnson for the operational mission control. So what did we find? Well, let me just say generally, I could spend another lecture talking about how to do a psychological study with astronauts, because it's challenging. It's less challenging now than it used to be, because we've had 15 years of it, and they kind of trust us. Nothing horrible has happened. No one's been grounded, and no identities have been revealed, because the way we analyze our data is at the group level. But when we first started, there was a lot. They didn't like psychologists, and God knows psychiatrists were even lower on the poll. And so we had to develop a strategy where we got some good science, we thought, to answer our hypotheses, but where it was relatively easy and we protected confidentiality. So we hit on basically using a set of questionnaires. They were brief. They could be done in about a half an hour once a week. So the arguments that were it's too much work, we said, but it's only half an hour once a week. Oh, okay. And then these were standardized measures that have been used in hundreds of studies on the ground. So their psychometric properties are well known. So whenever they would say, we don't like these questions, we want to change them, we would say, but these are standardized and they all interrelate and they're safe. They've been used on hundreds of studies, and they'd say, oh, okay. And then we had to develop ways of them having their own code, so that technically we didn't know which subject was which, as long as they had the same code number. Now, we could kind of figure out the Americans and Russians, because we had the questionnaires translated and back translated into Russian. So when we got back one Russian set of data in a 3-person crew with 1 Russian on board, we kind of figured out which one it was. But we basically just put it all together, and we didn't publish anything until we finished the whole series, so that no one could be singled out, so that if we said a commander said something, we had 6 commanders. You take your pick. If we do one mission and say the commander said something, everybody knows who it is. So We used a measure of mood, the PALMS, Profile of Mood States, a couple measures of group climate developed by Rudy Moose down in this area at Stanford and the VA, and then a critical incident log where they wrote down events. So we kept the design simple. We were interested in group level behavior, and from the measures that we used, though, we were able to isolate out a number of subscales. So for example, from the PALMS, a bunch of questions add together in a way that's inherent in the system of the questionnaire, and you get a measure of tension in a week. So you can monitor a score for each subject of their average tension levels. Or in the group environment scale of cohesion, where the subject would describe their group, and they'd fill out questions in different ways. They describe how their group is cohesive. And the questions didn't say, is your group cohesive? It had other things, like in this group, people are close to each other, for example, might be a cohesion question. But you add them together in a certain way, and some are reflected, which means you have a negative question, and so you have to flip the sign when you're adding it together to make it a positive score. But you get a measure of cohesion. You get a measure of leader support. You get a measure of leader control. I guess I should probably use this. Leader control, or work pressure. So week by week by week, we could track the subjective, and these are subjective measures, and they have their own problems, although most subjects were pretty good in giving us variances, so we thought they were being relatively honest in what they were saying it the way they felt. And then we could combine these scales together, and we could come up with scores that look something like this. Now this is one of the a summary of the data for cohesion. 0 is the midpoint of the mission. In the midpoint, the missions go from 13 weeks before the halfway point and another 13 weeks after. So this is a 26-week mission, and these are the average cohesion scores. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. We did it this way because we analyzed our data like a hinge. So we looked at a regression. For those of you who are interested in this, who care, I'll just say one thing about you get a regression line for the second half and a regression line for the first half, and you have the best line that you can get, and then you can compare statistically if there's any change from the first half to the second half. So that's the kind of way we analyzed it. And basically, these are actual average data points from a series of crews. And what do you see there? Well, in fact, we didn't see anything either. And so we did not find any evidence in any of our measures. We had 21 measures, 21 subscales. We just didn't find anything to show any changes over time, no third quarter phenomenon. In the MIR studies, we got similar data in the ISS studies. We combined them, we fiddled with it, we did analysis of variances, we did all kinds of statistics, and we just could not pull out an average change that pointed to some sort of difference in the crew environment over time. Now, it's not to say the individuals didn't work that way. We had some individuals, one of whom was especially vocal and had a classical third quarter kind of phenomenon. A lot of the scales in this person that were dysphoric or negative, depression and anxiety, they blipped up in the third quarter and then they dropped again later. So he had a third quarter experience, but others had no experience, and when you looked at it as a group, we couldn't find any statistical indication of stages. So, what does that mean? Well, we think what it means, and it turns out that other people have found similar things. Now, the tally is still in favor of third quarter because earlier studies seem to find them, but earlier studies, in my view, were not necessarily so rigorous, and people are looking for it. And so you, if you don't apply good statistics, you might say, gee, this kind of looks a little high. I think we've got a third quarter, and then it sort of drops in the second part of the third quarter. I mean, you could say anything you want. And we were pretty compulsive about only presenting data that we felt statistically met standard criteria. And so other people who have done the same thing have not found stages either. Now some have, so it's kind of up in the air still. I'm not saying we didn't find it. We still look for it in every study we do, but we just didn't find it here. And we think in part we didn't is because the support strategies are so good. You know, the Russians piloted psychological support groups when their cosmonauts were still going up in the Soyuz days. And they've developed that, and they've been really, really good at this. And the American side, as they started having long duration missions, it started off with some of the Russian experiences and added some of their own qualities. And so now the whole mission controls psychological support on really for all the countries involved is really very good. And so the astronauts, they're monitored. When they get a little blue, they talk to their wives, they talk to their kids, they talk to movie stars, they get surprise presents sent up, maybe a guitar, maybe a little vodka. They are asked to turn on the light a little brighter when they get kind of down. They're asked to play the music a little louder. Now they're on email, so they're in constant communication with family. So the psychological support for on-orbit crews has really been very, very good. We think that has washed out some of the effects of being on orbit for a long period of time on average. And that's why we didn't find it. We don't know that for sure. That's one explanation. In some ways, being in the Antarctic is more isolative than being in space, because now with satellites you can communicate almost all the time with the Earth. You don't have to just find certain periods when you're going over a tracking station. And with emails, it's just, you know, they can constantly talk to people. You know, you might get a call from an astronaut if you're a principal investigator, and they'll want to ask something. You know, so there's a lot of interaction. Keep that in mind when I talk later about what happens when you're going to Mars, because things change. I better hurry along because I won't get to Mars before this. Kind of like what's happening with us, huh? Displacement. We did find evidence for displacement. We predicted it. Displacement is, you know, you have a tough day here at SETI. You can't tell your boss off because it's your boss. You go home, you kick the cat. That's displacement. You basically take out your frustration and anger that's based on your interaction with somebody and take it out on somebody else who's safer to take it out on. A husband, a wife, a cat, you know, the wall. But it's basically a displacing of emotional state from one object, if you want to be psychiatric, object being a human object, to another that's safer. We predicted that would happen because there's been some evidence that when crews are under a lot of stress and pressure, and they can't talk to each other because, look, you know, you have two other people up there, and you owe your life to them. You can't tell them off. You don't want to make waves. You stuff it. You get territorial. You separate. You do your own thing, and then you yell at the ground control. So we predicted that when we had high levels of dysphoria in space, those would be the periods that we would have a perceived lack of support of people on the ground, and that there would be a positive correlation between those two factors. And in fact, in all 6 dysphoric measures, we found that. And so it might have been due to something else, but that relationship of negative feelings in space and in the group in space, and at the same time a sense that people on the ground just didn't care about you, is the way we operationally define displacement. And we found that in Mir, it was very robust, and in all the measures in the ISS mission as well. So we think that is probably a factor that seems to show some promise of being a real situation that's occurring, is a sense of displacing tension. I'm reminded of the famous Skylab strike. When you talk to some of the people involved in that Skylab strike, they say the ground just didn't understand us. And other people say this was a weird crew and they were tense and they just had a strike because, you know, they were having their own tension. Well, the second would be displacement. The first is a possibility. In our data, we could not find any indication when they were displacing that there were in fact problems on the ground that showed that the ground didn't understand the crew really. We think it's more just their perception based on tension that we found in space. We found some country differences between Americans and Russians. I won't go into all of them, but I'll mention, for example, the United States, the astronauts statistically had higher levels of work pressure, both in the Mir and in the ISS, probably for different reasons. The Mir, they were isolated and alone and didn't quite know what they were supposed to do. In the ISS, it's an American program. They had a lot of paperwork to do, a lot of things to monitor, a lot of business, and they were feeling under pressure compared to the Russians. But it might also be there's several kinds of culture. There's national culture. There's also organizational culture. The Russian space program is much more hang loose about things. You sort of do what you're supposed to do. If something happens, you call an expert on the ground, and he tells you how to best duct tape it together. In the American program, you've got triple redundancy. Everything has to be done in certain ways. It's a lot more you put a lot more work into just kind of doing normal maintenance. And so it might be an organizational culture that we're finding here, not necessarily a national culture of the people. We also found that the crew reported a lot less dysphoria. That is, they seem to be happier in their work environment in space than people in mission control. And you say, well, how can that be? It's so stressful in space. Well, astronauts, you know, they wait 10 years to fly, and this is their life, and they put up a lot, and they've learned how to put up a lot to fly, and they're so excited to be in space that, okay, what's a meteoroid once in a while, what's a little cold, what's a little, you know, hypogravity, we're here, and so they're just generally more upbeat. Plus, they may be more upbeat because of the kind of people they are. However, the mission control people are not so bad off because they are statistically less dysphoric and happier at their work than people like you and me and Ford Motor Company when you look at their data on these measures that are standardized with all the normative groups that they've been working on. So there seems to be a sense that people in mission control are much happier than you and me, and people who who are astronauts are much happier than them. It's kind of a continuum based on the work you're doing. But possibly the kind of person you are. We could not tease out those two factors. Finally, leadership. We found basically, both in space and on the ground, that the support role of the leader was positively and statistically correlated with cohesion in the group, which we predicted. Not a big surprise. We didn't find it with the task role, however, for space. We found it on the ground, that both roles correlated significantly with cohesion, that a leader, we predicted that it would indicate that the leader was both roles were important for the cohesiveness of the group. Why we didn't find it with the astronaut cosmonauts probably is we were studying small groups. Unfortunately, the luck of the draw for our studies were that we had 2- and 3-person crews. Now the crews are going to be expanding to 6. And when you have a 2- or 3-person crew, everyone is a task leader in their own area. You've got one pilot commander, and then you've got one engineer who knows how to do things the pilot commander doesn't know how to do. So it kind of washes off the task role. Everyone is kind of a leader in their own sphere. Now, on a mission to Mars, let's say you have 6 people, you might have a couple scientists, you might have 2 kinds of engineers, and so you'll see a more traditional, we think, kind of situation where the commander then is responsible for a bigger group. That's why we think we didn't find it in space, but, you know, again, who knows? We also did a study of positive effects. This is a survey separate from the Mir and the ISS. We surveyed 39 people who were active astronauts and cosmonauts or members of the Association of Space Explorers. And we had a whole number of factors we looked at. We asked them to rate these different questions that tied into, finally sorted into 8 factors in terms of what in space contributed to this being a positive experience. And we got a ranking, but the only one that stood out that was statistically above all the other factors was the sense of perception of Earth. Now, those of you who know about windows and being in space, not computer windows, the astronauts have always wanted to be able to see the ground. And it seems to really be an important factor for them. And to some extent, like, for example, even some cosmonauts, when Lebedev, when his mission, he wrote a diary of a cosmonaut, kind of a neat book if you get your hands on it. He wrote a book called Diary of a Cosmonaut, and his diary. When he was sort of separating emotionally from his fellow crew member, he reverted to his hobby, which was taking pictures. And it kind of saved him because he spent a lot of time taking pictures of the Earth and looking out the window. And so we've basically just found that. Of all the factors that we analyzed, seeing the Earth is important. Again, keep that in mind for what I say a little later. Okay, finally we're getting now, so that's kind of what we know. That's sort of our database. Now how do we project that in terms of longer term missions? What can we say? This is characteristics of some planetary missions. Now a couple caveats. Some of you may recognize that the average distance from Earth of these different planets happens to be the average distance of those planets from the sun. There's a couple ways of thinking about the distance between a planet and the Earth. One way is to look at the orbit of the Earth and the orbit of the planet and look at the average difference in the orbits. And that's a legitimate way of thinking about it. From our viewpoint, we were interested in communication delays. And when you think about it, Jupiter kind of trundles around its orbit in, 12 years? And meanwhile, the Earth is zooming around close and far and close and far and close and far. So if you're talking to someone when they're close, it's 93 million miles times 2 closer than if the Earth is on the other side of the orbit. So how to represent that distance meaningfully, I have chosen to take the average. And where does the average of that put you? Right in the middle of the sun, more or less. And so that's why I use these figures. I think it's legitimate. I'm interested if any of you have any different way of thinking about it. But I think it's a more legitimate reason, mean number to think about for comparative purposes than simply the average distance in the orbits. The difference is not great except for Mars. Anyway, we're talking maybe 10, 20 minutes in communication. But Mars, of course, being very oblongish, it makes a big difference in how you report the data. At any rate, if you can buy this for now anyway, these are the average distances of these planets from the Earth. So the communication time at the speed of light, if you're in the middle of Mars and you want to reach the Earth, on average, it's going to take 25 minutes to get an answer because of the distance on average. If it's closer, it'll take less. If it's farther, it'll take longer. The extreme, if Mars is on the extreme oblongness of its orbit, aphelion, and the Earth is on the other side of the sun, is up to 44 minutes. So you can't very well have a chat with your kids in real time when you're sitting on Mars. And what does this do then to your support system when you're depending on communicating with the ground, yet the communication delay is so long that you can't do it? Plus, how do you communicate? So these are the figures, and you can see it gets really outrageous. If you're going to Jupiter, it's 87 minutes for a round-trip communication, 159 minutes to Saturn, and let's worry about these planets later. This is the duration, taking the planned round-trip mission duration going to and from Mars, and extrapolating it based on distance. That's where these figures come from. Normal chemical propulsion systems that we currently are using, nothing new, taking the Mars planning and just extrapolating it on to the other planets, at least for now. So you can see how long these missions are. 1.3 years. Now this does not take into account how long you're on the planet. It's just round trip. Going to Mars, coming back, it's about 6 months out, 6 months back, roughly. 8 months out and 8 months back, excuse me, 1.3 years. Jupiter, it's about 4.5 years round trip. Saturn, 8.3 years. For comparison, this is the actual Voyager 2 time that it took to get to these planets, one way times 2. And it's not too far different. Under normal chemical systems that we currently have, the current technology, we're talking about maybe a 4-year round trip to Jupiter, about 8 years going to Saturn, about 17 years to Uranus, and so on. So my point is these are long missions, and the time delay to talk to your family and friends and psychologists on Earth is not real time at all. So how does this affect then psychologically the kind of crews we have? First of all, now we're just going to look at Mars first, and the shorter areas going maybe to Jupiter, Saturn. Missions that are within about 10 to 15 years, okay? Under standard propulsion systems. First of all, you have increased crew autonomy. The crew's going to have to plan their own schedule. They're going to have to be big boys and girls and work out what they're going to do. They can't depend on a schedule coming up every day for mission control. Something happens, you got to take care of it. Somebody gets psychotic and suicidal, they're going to have to deal with it in space. They can't evacuate that person back easily. Someone has appendicitis, they're going to have to take it out, unless they took the appendices out of everybody before they launch, which is talked about. So the point is they're really going to be autonomous. Second, there's going to be unprecedented dependency on onboard technical resources. Think 2001, the movie. You know, you're going to have a computer controlling everything. Or let's take Star Trek. A lot of human-machine interactions are going to occur. How does that feel psychologically when you have such a dependency on a machine that may, in fact, have some problems to it? The delays on the Earth I mentioned is going to be a factor. You're going to have to design a different way of thinking about how you relate to the Earth. Increase isolation and monotony. It's bad enough being on orbit, going around and around, but you can at least see the Earth. And you kind of feel close to home because you can talk to home. What happens when you're going to Mars and the Earth becomes an insignificant dot in space? How close do you feel to home? I mean, no human being ever, I challenge anyone to have an exception, this will get this group awake, has ever experienced the Earth as an insignificant dot. It's either been a nice, beautiful ball, and there it is, it's the Earth, or I'm on it. And so the point is, what does it mean to see it as a pale, kind of bluish-green dot way out there? And that's where your family, that's where your culture, that's where your history, that's where everything you ever have cared about, trees, is located. What does that mean psychologically? So I think in these kind of intermediate missions, there are some things we can think about as countermeasures based on what we know. First of all, I think it's a selection of a crew. You're going to have to select crews where they have not only an ability to, and this is what the current right stuff is, the ability to take care of yourself and do a project and do your data analysis and do your practice for digging rocks on Mars and so on. You're going to have to do that when you need to, but also socialize when you can as well, and feel comfortable not only being kind of schizoid and withdrawn and geeky, but also being outgoing and relating and trying to keep relationships equally as important. And so you're going to have to select people with both abilities. The commanders are going to have both task and support leadership skills and be sensitive not only to just the work and how to fly the rocket, but interpersonal issues and monitoring the crew and how are people doing and how can I be a little more valuable to them. In terms of education, I think all these factors that we've talked about needs to be set up in the training before they launch. The issue of autonomy and time-delayed communication is an area that's got to be looked at and perhaps discussed with the crews. How are you going to monitor things? When are you going to call us? How are we going to deal with the interactions? I think in training, you're going to have both a didactic and experiential component, and train the crew with ground control. If the ground control is going to be out of the loop, they have to be comfortable that the crew can handle certain things, and they got to be able to kind of project what the crew is going to think and say during times that they can't communicate. So a lot of the training that's done now is only the crew members over here and the mission control over there. On long duration flights, Mars and beyond, the training is going to have to involve key members of both groups interacting together, almost reading each other's minds because you can't talk in real time. During the mission, psychosocial education training, you might have refresher courses on the computer about things that are important, and oh, it's halfway, and you better be careful, maybe halfway, there might be some psychological changes, and some people, not Kanas, others have found third quarter, you might just be aware of it. So there's going to be ongoing refresher training. I think the crew members are going to have to self-correct problems. They can't depend on the ground hearing them in real time and saying, I think Igor's a little cranky, maybe he's having some asthenia. They're going to have to self-correct themselves. And I think putting in time for the crews to have bull sessions and talk about, hey, what are we doing? How is it going? Can we fix any problems we're having with each other? I think is an important thing to do. How do you see the Earth from afar when it's a pale blue dot? You put up a telescope. Oops, what did I just do? All right, let's see. I better go back to. You put up a telescope on board.
You keep talking.
Okay, and that's one way of seeing the Earth in real time. It's a simple way, but you got to think about it. And I think that might help to create this issue of there is an Earth, and that's what it looks like right now, minus the time it takes for the light to reach you. Email strategies. When you write your wife, you have demand questions at the end of it. You don't say, how are you doing? And then you wait 44 minutes. You say, how are you doing? A, how are the kids? What's happening? Blah, blah, blah. B, did you go to the flower show? Did you do this? C, how about new clothes? How's your mother? And then when she responds back in 44 minutes, she answers the questions. It's a more efficient way of communicating. Some sort of way of communicating more efficiently has to be done. And then support on the families at home is really important. Coming back, the first Mars trip is going to be fame and glory all over again, just like the first moon trip. So the astronauts have to be ready not only to readapt to their family life and get things back to normal, but how you're going to adapt to being the crew on the first Mars mission. Pretty exciting stuff. Okay, when we go beyond, say, Uranus, we're now talking about 17 decades-long missions. So, and then when you go beyond to the Oort cloud or the stars, you're going to have to start thinking about how are we going to speed this up. I mean, if at the rate that Voyager is trucking out into space, it'll take just a very brief 497,000 years to reach Sirius, for example. So, who's going to wait around that long? So something's going to have to give, and these are the kinds of things we're going to have to start thinking about. Speedier propulsion systems. This is a really good book, Interstellar Travel and Multi-Generational Spaceships. It's a series of papers from a conference held in Boston in 2002. The first half is all on propulsion systems, ion drives, solar sails. The second half is all on sociological things. It's very unusual to find both areas covered in one book. So, and in my paper, I referenced some of these papers in here. You can get this on Amazon. It's really cool if you're interested in both the engineering side of things as well as the psychological and sociological side of things. I'll leave this up there for you to look at. Suspended animation. Not so good for the family, but maybe the only way you can get a crew member to go to on a decades-long mission somewhere. And then finally, generation ships to colonize space. If you're really talking about 100 to 200 years, you're going to really talk about just leaving Earth forever and never coming back, or at least not in anyone's lifetime. So what does that do to you? Well, first of all, speedier propulsion systems. Okay, so now we're awake. We're going to Uranus, and we crank up the speed because we've got a nuclear power or an ion generator. Ion's probably not so good, but nuclear power or some sort of solar sail or something that's propelling us out. So we're going to, let's say, Uranus. Well, who's going to go? First of all, you're going to probably find a subset of human beings who are willing to do this. I mean, right now, I had an Apollo astronaut one time tell me in the space shuttle days, he says, I don't know how people are doing this. He says, in my day, you'd be launched and go up and expect to come home the next day in time for tea. And so the certain right stuff quality of a flight up and back, or even a flight to a space shuttle, is different from the kind of person that's going to go 7 months on the space station. These are people whose families have to adapt. These are people who are going to have to get used to being in an environment away from home for a long time. Well, imagine going for 30 years to an outer planet. Who's going to do it? You have to see the selection. You're going to have to select for a kind of a person. Do you take single people? Do you take people who are older and don't have roots at home? Do you take younger people who are just so dedicated they don't care? Can a normal family situation occur where you're going? It's going to be a challenge to figure out the best kind of person to send. And who's going to volunteer to go? Some astronauts now do not volunteer for space station because they don't want to be away from their family for so long. We don't know the effects of traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. My physics friends say nothing because it doesn't matter if you approach light, everything changes, but you don't know the difference, and so you're okay. However, some people have written, for example, about in the interstellar medium, there are particles, and as you're zooming along towards those particles, you're going through them kind of like a beam coming back at you, like going in a snowstorm. If you're racing down the hill, the snow can burn your eyes because you're going through it so fast. Well, what about radiation particles hitting your vehicle? How's that going to change your physiology and your psychology? What kind of shielding do you use? If their physiology has changed, what does it do to your mind? Who knows? Isolation and loneliness will be even more so, and lack of support from Earth we've talked about. Some of these other factors I mentioned, disappearing Earth, filling time over the years, it's a long time. 30 years is a long time. What are you going to do day to day, when it gets a little kind of boring and slow? You're going to have the same 6 or 8 or 10 people to see every day. Maybe after 3 years you get tired of them. How do you keep your leisure time going? There's some evidence that people change their hobbies over time in space stations. They start off liking certain activities and later they change. So you're going to have enough capability on board to allow people to evolve over time with their interests. Increased risk for medical and psychiatric illnesses with time, lack of novelty, and then coming home to a new world. The old joke in science fiction about you come home and you meet your grandkids and they're older than you are. And so what happens when you come back and everyone you've known is dead or decrepit, or your kids who you left as kids are now have their own kids, and you suddenly see them and here you're a grandfather. So there's a lot of returning things. Nobody knows about suspended animation. First of all, if it's possible, what does it mean psychologically to give up your mind to a machine for a long period of time? I mean, when you're hitting the button and the thing is coming down to close you off and the gases are starting to infiltrate, how do you feel about that? Who would want to do it? You really lose control, and you have a long time for something to happen, to kill you. So it's a psychological burden that people kind of gloss over. Oh, it's great, we'll just put them to sleep for 20 years and who cares? Well, boy, I would care if it was me. And then the technology. Who knows how the technology might affect the brain and the body? You can do certain things to slow down metabolism, but how long can you do it? What can you do? And how is the brain? And what if you wake up and your brain is mush? I mean, it can make a difference as to what you do. Now the colonizing thing is a lot of fun to think about. Again, who would go? Who would go leaving the Earth saying, I'm never coming back? Well, they're like the immigrants, right? Well, they're not like the immigrants. You have somebody coming over here. My parents came from Greece, and they come over here, and they're here, right? But they go back, if they want, every year to visit the old family. You can get back. The pilgrims, maybe they don't go back, but their kids go back. So when you're on, middle of, if you're on Alpha Eridani or someplace, you can't go back, really. So it makes a difference to your psychology. How do you set up a diverse group? What kind of language do you use? What about religious freedom? What do you do in a small 150-person colony on a big multi-generational ship heading to a planet on a star that's maybe 120 years away? How do you set up the group going into it to make it diverse enough where you can have it persist over the generations? The first generation is going to be pretty homesick. The second generation will just hear the stories. The third generation will probably not even identify with the Earth, except maybe through pictures and photographs. And so you're going to have that shifting in mental state as well. How do you set up the birth? I noticed in the lecture you had in April, some questions were asked here about what do you do about birthing. Well, there's a great discussion in this book by Moore, who did computer generation models of going to a star, and a planet in a distant star, about 180 people. How do you set it up? And one of the models that worked is you have 2 clans, like the Hatfields and McCoys, and you have people mating across clans to keep the genetic diversity going. And within the groups, you have 3 cohorts. So you have people going up and you say, look, you want to go no babies until you're 35, women. And guys, leave them alone until they're 35. 35, everybody has babies for 5 years. 30 years later, you have a second cohort. Same number, 60, 60, because you're planning and controlling how many people are born. You got a license, you had 2 babies, that means you can't have any. So you have roughly 60 people in cohort 1. 30 years later, another 60 people, and 30 years later, another 60. So you have 3 generations at one time. The old folks are the teachers, kind of slowing down, the masters, and the babysitters. The middle folks do the work, they're the adults, they handle things, and the kids are learning and are growing, and by God, they're not going to have any sex until they're 30. So this seemed to create a model that was fairly stable in his computer generations. It's something to think about. I mean, how do you set up a society? Now, what happens, though, when the 3rd generation kids grow up and they say, this is crap. I don't want this stuff. I'm not going to do this. You know, I'm going to be a teenager and rebel. I'm going to have sex with Jane. Or even worse, I don't even want to go to this planet. Let's go home. So how do you take care of shifting values in different generations? You're going to have a new generation that's never seen home. Maybe some of them will have a tremendous longing. It's going to be like myths. Are there gods back on Earth? You know, they're going to start thinking about it in a way differently from that first generation. They may rebel, and they may rebel in a way that affects the mission. So I think one has to think about how are we going to persist on the values and keep this environment stable. Last thing before I stop, and this group knows this, why go into space? It's such a headache. I mean, I've presented this thing. Why bother? Well, these are some of the reasons. You know, we're going to survive, no comet. We keep ourselves scientifically vibrant by exploring the unknown. We search for extraterrestrial life. Got that, SETI folks? And there's probably economic reasons. I mean, the Oort cloud is interesting. There's a nice article here by Freeman Dyson on why go to the Oort cloud, and he says because there's nuclei and we can mine it and there may be life. So there might be commercial reasons to go into deep space as well that probably will help us outweigh some of these negatives, and I think probably a lot of the negatives will be able to be dealt with. Okay, I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions. Yes, sir.
As far as I know, there's been no husband-wife teams in space. Have there been husband-wife teams on some of these Antarctic missions and other isolated missions, and how does that work relative to? Well,
this is a big discussion, and I'll give you some of the facts in my opinion, which is as good as anybody's, or as bad as anybody's. The argument is, what do you do? Well, there've been studies where people have looked at couples in the Antarctic and on polar missions, and there was even one mission where a couple had a baby on it, and then the biosphere had 8 people. Biosphere was this 2-year thing in Arizona, had 8 people. 4 of them were 2 couples and the other 4 were singles, and they tried to look at it. So there's been some experiments of looking at coupling. The arguments against coupling is, first of all, if you have a problem in space, you know, how effective is a crew member going to be when it's his wife is at risk? Maybe the wife has to do the emergency spacewalk because she's been trained. How do you deal with that, you know? It's not just another crew member, it's your wife. Second of all, what is the guarantee that a couple will stay loyal for, you know, a long duration mission? There's no real guarantee. Some people said, oh, we only should send couples up into space, but maybe there'll be some stability, but on biosphere there wasn't especially a lot of stability. They tried. I mean, the 4 couples tried to do it, and the singles kept kind of after them to that party bit, but there's no guarantee. And in the Antarctic, as we got more women, there's been shifting of relationships, you know. So my feeling about it is that in a mission to Mars or beyond, I think you will have men and women, and I think that you might as well just train everybody and do the best you can, and they're going to do what we all do on Earth anyway. And you're going to probably have some mixing and matching. You're going to have somebody who's going to have maybe a sexual experience in space, and then when they get back home, it's forgotten, you know, when they get back to their original wife or husband. So I think that there are probably more important issues in selecting a crew having to do with who's going to pay for it. So we got to have maybe a couple Russians and a couple Americans and a couple Europeans. Who can do the work? And you got to have certain duties and cross-training ability, so certain people are going to be able to go. And you're going to have men and women because you're just going to have to do it that way, I think. I don't buy the Russian model that, you know, we're going to be like the original pioneers. I think society would not pay and be willing to send an all-male crew or an all-female crew. So I think there will be probably men and women, and they probably will be selected more for other factors than trying to have a forced coupling. Yeah.
Kim Stanley Robinson wrote a great technical reference, of course, called Red Mars. And in the introduction to that novel, the crew selection for the second Mars mission with 100 plus participants, was undertaken in the Antarctic for a few months, 6 or 12 months. It turned out later on in the book, and I hope I don't spoil things for folks not having read it, that, of course, the behavior patterns of those members on selection were modified subconsciously to fit the profile of selection. And then a whole bunch of political and social issues then arose once they were on the mission. And I think even before they reached Mars, there was a lot of character attributes surfacing. So how does one in crew selection compensate?
Well,
for
I think
that?
crew selection is a start, but not the finish. That humans evolve over time. None of us are locked into the way we were at a certain age. We change as we evolve over time. And so I think that you can select out. You probably don't want to select an alcoholic or a person who's heavily loaded in their family for schizophrenia to go on a long-duration space mission. Selecting in, no one has been able to really get yet with complete fidelity. But then that's the case. I had the same situation on predicting suicidality. I can see a person who, for suicide, and I can pretty much guarantee when they walk out the door they won't kill themselves in the first minute. But the next 5 hours, I'm not so sure, and the next day, I'm less sure, and the next week, you flip a coin. And so you can't predict behavior completely. Somebody might come in and be a great psychological person, and there have been studies where they've tried to predict who's going to do well as astronauts, and they don't do very well. Yes, the really horror shows you can do okay on, but for the average astronaut that's selected, some do good, some do bad. Some college students do better than others. You can't predict necessarily who's going to do it. So I think we're just going to have to do the best we can. Now, there is some training you can do. I think that when you go into Mars, it's probably useful to do a little bit of time on a space station to practice what it's like to be with microgravity and to take care of the outbound and return phases of a Mars mission. And it's probably good to be on the moon bouncing around under a little bit of gravity, banging on some rocks to get a feeling of what that's like before you go to Mars. So you can do some training in these different environments in preparation. I think it's a mistake to do a 2.5-year simulation, though, and then send somebody on a 2.5-year real mission, because they're probably burned out from the first one. And so you have to kind of adjust it and try and be as realistic as you can to train and give them an experience and kind of watch them, and then have a lot of support and countermeasures on board where they can self-monitor and self-correct.
Yeah, I had a mini experience of this when I spent 10 days in a tent at the South Pole, and it's basically an ocean of ice, and there's nothing, not a bird, not a blade of grass, no bugs, nothing. What struck me is when I came back to civilization, I was in a taxi from the airport, and I saw a tree, and I was like, look, a tree, look, a bird, look, grass. How do you deal with sensory deprivation when you go on a trip like this?
Well, I think, if it's a real long-duration trip, you can, you have to take care of it. For example, like I mentioned, a telescope to really see the Earth. You could probably have computerized versions. A lot of people are experimenting with plants, not only as possible food supplies and also to look at the biology of plants in microgravity, but as a kind of a psychological boost. And so having plants or pets or something on board can help give a feeling for some of this earthiness, even though you're in a very sterile, hostile environment. So I think there are ways of doing it. It's artificial. It's usually looking at TV monitors of simulations and maybe holograms. But you can help obviate some of this, I think, by some of these technical methods, and then having real life on board.
Two brief questions over
Where
here.
are you?
Here.
Oh, okay, hi.
Hi. Two questions. One, it seems like a lot of this, the psychosocial training that you're doing of how people can get along and that sort of intense communication work would be really a fascinating application to global leaders with Spaceship Earth about how we might get along under very stressed situations instead of creating the aggressions and problems that we have on Spaceship Earth. That would be really interesting. And the other question was, have you done any exploration of like people who've gone into long meditative retreats, like some of these people who've gone into 1 year or 2 year or 3 year sort of meditative retreats in the Asian traditions, and what things they've encountered in their things, or looking at that. I know UCLA is doing a lot of the stress work with mindfulness and these kinds of, looking at those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, I think as an experience, this kind of thing probably wouldn't help you much in space, because you're not isolated in space, you're with other people anymore. I mean, being in an isolation chamber, for example, is not good training for being in a crew, because when you're in a crew, you're not isolated, you have people around. But in terms of a kind of a support for you being in a meditative state or getting some feedback training, autogenic training, I think those are good mechanisms, and I think there's somebody still at Ames doing some work on autogenic training, and the Russians are very interested in this. I think any way you can relax your mind and get yourself a break from other crew members who you may be a little bit tired of is probably a good thing as a coping strategy. Your first comment, not a question, I agree with. I think we learn a lot about how to get along with each other. I mean, I was thrust in the Mir study with having to work with Russians. Now, I happen to know some Russians because I did some work before then, and I got to meet some people, so I had some people that I knew. But in planning I think the odds are that the first trip to Mars and beyond will probably be international. Now, I may be wrong, but I think it will, because it's so expensive. And I think we are forced then to work out a lot of interpersonal issues with the group. And then watching how a multinational crew gets along does set a kind of a role model and a very visible one to the rest of us. So I think these are good things in fostering international relationships and ways of dealing with cultures that aren't our own. Okay.
You didn't say very much about our submarine crews. How long were they isolated, and what kind of communications did they have with their families, and what kind of problems did they have?
Yeah, actually, I got my start in this business when I was a student, a medical student. I worked out a situation at Johnson for a few months to do a literature search, and this was 1970, and it came out, the result was a monograph on a hypothetical trip to Mars, and the only data I had was Antarctic and submarine crews. The submarine crews are very good analogs. One of our studies we've recently looked at, autonomy, was a NEMO mission, a couple NEMO missions, which are on a submersible. The submarine crews are good. The trouble is nowadays they tend not to be quite so long, so you don't have a period of months and months and months on a submarine. Some of the original work that was done on family reunitement, though, was done on submarines, and it coined the term the submariners' wives syndrome. And there have been two huge studies done in the 60s, which is kind of interesting. Basically, you have these submariners, largely men, going off on submarines for variable periods of time. Meanwhile, the wives figure out how to take care of themselves. They have support groups. They have the kids handled. They pay the bills. Everything is great. They stabilize. Then the husbands come back and want to take over. And guess what? 50% or more, that's where you're seeing depression. You're seeing marital breakups. It's readjusting to the return, where you have this foreign body coming back into the system, the husband, and readjusting all over again. And so I think the readjustment is a big issue. It's called the submariner's wives syndrome. It's even coined that way in a couple of big studies.
But they communicate.
Well, a lot of military families have learned how to do this, and the military is really good at setting up support networks. NASA has support groups for spouses, for example. But in some cases, they wouldn't communicate, and that's where you had the problem. This was the half of the people where you had depression in the wife and marital strife and all this stuff, and it just was a train wreck. So I guess the return back is really very important as well, to prepare families for this return. It's not just being separated, it's what it's like coming back. So, yeah. No.
I have one comment and one question. It seems to me like having to give up all of these problems, to face all of these problems, we're going to have a hard time finding a quote unquote normal person who would want to go through this, because we're basically social animals.
Yeah.
And my second question is, what about medical problems? Are you going to train doctors and dentists to go with the crew?
Well, I would guess that on any big deal first mission, you're going to have a doc on board. Probably trained in emergency medicine, but having to have some kind of knowledge of psychological issues. And you're probably going to have a tech, somebody counter-trained as a tech, because what happens when the doctor gets sick? You know, this poor woman in the Antarctic who had breast cancer, things happen to doctors too. So my guess is there'll probably be a real doctor on board, and then there'll be another person cross-trained. There'll be a lot of cross-training over, say, a 6-person crew. Medical's a problem. There have been talks about on the first mission, you select your crew, you replace all of their fillings in their teeth. You take out their appendix prophylactically. You know,
Take the teeth out.
Yeah, or take the teeth out.
Take all the vital organs out.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, what do you consider vital? It's interesting. So the point is, how far do you go, and how much civil rights do you violate, versus a person saying, "I'll just take my chances. You know, I want my colon." And you know, so how do you decide that? You know, it's kind of a tricky situation. The first question about oddballs.
Yeah.
You know, there have always been oddballs, and God knows I'm not saying any of the astronauts are oddballs, but you know, the first explorers were pretty peculiar too, but they got the job done for the rest of us. So it's okay to be a little eccentric and odd when you're going to Mars. It's okay to be kind of gruff and stubborn and obsessive when you're a surgeon. It's okay to be flowery and hysterical when you're a great actress or ballet dancer. You know, this is what the job means, and it keeps it open for the rest of us to advance. So what is normal is kind of tricky. The key thing is you get a cohesive, bonded group that seem to get along and relate well with each other, with a certain minimum of social skills and a certain minimum of being able to work on your own. That's kind of the key. But you're right, exactly where you go beyond that, I'm not sure I could tell you.
Did the Antarctic studies that you looked at control for or talk about the tremendous amount of drinking, alcohol abuse, and alcoholism in the population of people that go to Antarctica versus the U.S. general population?
Yeah, it's a big problem, especially these days, because the Antarctic bases are pretty large now, and you don't screen as well as you used to. And some of the earlier explorers, when you had 3 or 4 or 5 people, you know, you could kind of keep a tight ship. And now it's a problem because there is alcohol, there are men and women, there are you know, a lot of things going on, and they seem to deal with it like we deal with it in society. You know, sometimes someone gets drunk and you cover up. Other times you send them home if they really can't be controlled. So it's kind of the way it is in society. On a space mission, it's going to be hard. You have the advantage of controlling the environment. So you can control the amount of alcohol. And in space, that's probably worked pretty well. But in some of the simulations, the famous Sphinx study where you had a Russian crew and they gave them a little bit too much alcohol, plus some of them smuggled it on board. This is on the Earth. They had a simulation. And some of the Russians got drunk and there was blood on the wall. They got into a fight, and then one of the Russians kissed a Canadian woman and she was all perturbed, and the Japanese guy couldn't stand all the anger and he quit. And you know, it was a catastrophe. And so here was an example of alcohol getting in, sort of surreptitiously, and then in the guise of having a party, a New Year's Eve celebration, it got a little bit out of control. So it's still a problem for isolated groups.
We just have one here.
Well, you actually had a question too, for a while. Okay.
Okay, I have a question about
Oh, I see. The person with this is the person.
personality types. Like, in other words, you want to have a cohesive crew, but what about having a balance of people that are extroverted, introverts, and thinkers and feelers? I mean, I didn't see anything about if it's important to have a diversity of actual personality types, or maybe a certain personality type. Like on your, I didn't see much. Can you make a comment about that, please?
There's been a lot of studies on that, and some of the things are, as you mentioned, to have a kind of a balance along standard psychological tests. The current state of the art looks more at dimensions related to the 2 areas I discussed, the social skills and the ability to kind of work on a project intensely when you need to. And there have been some new measures designed to look at that specifically for groups under isolated and confined environments. Some of the earlier studies that looked at MMPIs and 16PFs and things like that looked at some complementarity as being important. So if you have somebody in the group who's a little bit maybe too aggressive, it's good to have somebody who's a kind of a counterforce to calm them down. At the risk of offending the ladies in the room, some of the Europeans, not me, have done these isolation studies where they've thrown a woman in. And first of all, I should mention, it's really hard to be the only person of your kind in a small group under isolation, the only woman, the only non-English speaker, the only non-Russian speakers we found in Mir. You're isolated right away and the pressure's on you. But they felt in the Russian studies that in a couple of cases that a couple of the men, the leader and another leader were sort of going at it and competing, that the woman was sort of the socializer and made nice, and that the men behaved differently. Now there is some data in the Antarctic that that's the case, that women tend to stabilize the men down a bit from the earlier. I mean, men are going to act a little better around a woman in some ways than not. Whether men stabilize relationships among women, I don't know that, because usually you start with a bunch of men first, you start adding the women and you see how it changes. There have been studies of all women crews in submersibles, and they've performed about as well as the men. There's not a big difference statistically in how they perform, so it may not make a big difference. But the heterogeneous male-female crews are usually where there's been the greatest interest.
Last question.
Well, yeah, a couple of questions. One is, the multi-generational missions are a bit of a problem for me because, at the beginning you can be very selective about the crew and gain control over at least the intermediate term behavior of the crew during that time. But the next generation, you're going to be completely exposed to all the range of social, behavioral, and good things and bad things. And I can imagine that at some point you're going to need a correctional facility for a few members on board a space mission, and that could be a serious problem. That could actually be a real limitation, how long a crew can be out. The second thing is that I think one of the historically interesting examples of people leaving and not going back is over the last couple of hundred years, of course, during the European colonization of much of the world. Many people really actually have left without any intentions of ever going back. Thinking about, say, for example, prisoners going to Australia, for example, and not going back. American colonists, for example, or English colonists going to India, or we're both offspring of immigrants. Your parents came from Greece, as you say, and my parents came from China. My situation is a little different from yours. Your parents could go back to Greece. But in the case of my parents, the whole country shut down for 30 years, and there was not even any opportunity to communicate. So, and judging from my own personal experience, there was a lot of social isolation and depression that was virtually guaranteed in that circumstance. So I don't know. I think that long-term missions are really problematic. The only thing that basically saved maybe the colonists is because they still lived in a place where there was an atmosphere and nobody could pull a plug on something and wipe out the entire colony. So I'm just tossing out some random issues that could be a problem where there's no prospect of coming back, of returning.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there are some examples, and we can look to those and see. Although the people who can go back and choose not to are another sort of special case. I think what you said about the generations. With every generation, you're kind of mixing things up a bit, and you're having less control over who you got. And yeah, you can teach them, you can train them, you can brainwash them, you can do anything. But you know how teenagers are, and so it's going to be less predictable that second, because they never signed on to come on board, and they're going to find themselves on board, and how that really relates can't be known for sure. So.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know you've got plenty more questions, and I encourage you to come up and speak to Nick just after this. Nick, we have a special SETI pin to commemorate your talk here, which I think we all found very interesting. So please join me in thanking Nick.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.